If you study history for any amount of time, something you realize rather quickly is that luck often plays as big, if not a bigger role, than the individual talents of the people involved, the resources of the various states, or the fitness of the military. You might have the best trained, best equipped fleet in the ancient world, but a bad Mediterranean storm destroys it, and you don't have that advantage anymore, and you've lost all the money you invested in it. Maybe you have an unstoppable army of elephants, and then a disease breaks out, and all your elephants die, and your standard army is completely helpless. Maybe kind of a more recent example is America had built this big mechanized army for South Vietnam, but Nixon got impeached and he couldn't send them fuel or munitions anymore, and they had to abandon all of their infantry fighting vehicles and tanks because they couldn't move them anymore. The point is, I would argue that there are probably maybe, I don't know, 50, 70, 80% of the great generals and great statesmen are just never given the opportunity because of what they're born in. Maybe they slip and fall, maybe they get a disease or something, and they're just never in the position. They're the right person at the right time, but they're not in the right place. And so when you get that rare case, when you have the right person, the right place, and the right time, that's really when history starts to get made. That's when you have the great men who make history. And I would argue one of the keys to greatness is not only luck, but the ability to make the best out of luck. That is, if a situation presents itself, the ability to take advantage of it, or the ability to mitigate whatever the disaster is. And so periodically throughout history, we do see these incidents where someone has a stroke of good fortune. Maybe the enemy capitulates very quickly. Maybe you're like Aurelian and you have the dream where you're being told that you have to be merciful, and then you're merciful, and the enemy just completely surrenders because they know that you're not going to cut their heads off. Maybe something like that happens. And that's often seen as divine intervention. But sometimes you get so many lucky incidents that happen, so many of the stars align, that to any normal person, it really does seem like God is on your side, and that the heavens are trying to make things go your way. And when we talk about the rise of Islam, regardless of what your religious persuasion is, it really does almost look like divine intervention. So many things wound up happening at just the right time that the people of the Arabian Peninsula were able to go from this to this in the matter of less than a century, just a couple of decades, to go from just the Rashidun Caliphate to the Umayyad Caliphate that controlled everything from Hispania all the way to Pakistan. And once again, let's just think about this. So this is 737, and then the rise of Islam happened pretty much 100 years prior to that. It's got to be one of the biggest conquests in human history. Granted, it took longer, but it kind of makes what Alexander did looks almost kind of insignificant by comparison. But how did this happen? How did this go to this in such a short period of time? Well, to start with, we have to go back once again to Justinian the Great. Now, as we discussed previously, the Roman Empire had collapsed. We could talk about why it collapsed at some other date, but the western half of it collapsed, the eastern half continued. And Justinian came to power with a full treasury, an extremely militarily strong state, and he decided that he was going to rebuild the Roman Empire. And so he launched a series of campaigns. First, he defeated the Sassanids, and then he retook a lot of North Africa. Now, it should be noted that if you start to look at it, he wiped out the Vandal kingdom, so this became Byzantine territory, and they launched a limited invasion of Spain and retook some of southern Iberia, which I believe weakened the Visigothic state that controlled that portion of Spain at the time. We'll get back to the Visigoths in a bit. But Justinian had basically destroyed all the other major powers in the Mediterranean, other than the Persians at this time. He also embarked on an extremely ambitious building program that bankrupted the Byzantine state, combined with the plague of Justinian, which completely devastated the empire's population and also devastated the population of the Sassanids. So already we have, like, 60 years before Muhammad shows up on the scene, a massive war where Justinian wipes out, greatly devastates most of the major Mediterranean powers, overextends himself. The two superpowers of the day are severely weakened by plague. Now, another thing that happens around this time period is climate change. So there's climate change, there is a cooling period which greatly devastates the crop yields in both Byzantium and in the Sassanid state. However, the cooling period actually makes agriculture work better in the Arabian Peninsula, so the population there is able to increase and grow more prosperous, while at the same time the two states undergo an even bigger issue. Furthermore, we get into the Byzantine Sassanid War, which we talked about last time, in which it was a 30-year-long slugfest between the two superpowers, in which the Sassanids overran most of the eastern half of the Byzantine Empire before being defeated in Heraclius's immense comeback. But the point is that it was catastrophic. So not only do we have Justinian shaking everything up and overextending the Byzantine Empire, not only do we have a plague, not only do we have famine and climate change, but we also have one of the biggest, bloodiest slugfests in history. And it's into this environment that Muhammad emerges. Now, as I said, the balance of power, even if it was rather slight, had been shifting in an Arabian direction. The Arab population had been increasing. The Sassanids and Romans were no longer able to exert quite the same amount of pressure on their Arab client states that they used to be able to. And I think a couple of the major kingdoms in the area, I think the Yemen kingdom and a couple other different places, had collapsed during this period of time. So into this political vacuum comes Muhammad. And I won't get into the religious aspect of Islam and how it was founded and how you feel about Muhammad being a prophet. But something that Islam achieved that nothing else had really done previously was Islam is a totalitarian or totalistic way of looking at the world. It covers not just your religious beliefs, it covers your laws, down to often very minute details about yourself. And there's a very strong component within Islam that nation is secondary, race is secondary, all this stuff is secondary. What matters is whether you're Islamic or not. And we will eventually, when it comes to the Abbasids, have kind of a showdown between those who want the caliphate and the Islamic Empire to be an Arab affair and those who want a more of a pan-Islamic culture. But we're just dealing with the Arabian Peninsula at the moment. So when Muhammad starts to convert people to his cause, they start to leave behind at least somewhat their tribal identities, and you can start getting people who might not have liked each other previously to work together. And you have this population who's very tough. You have Bedouins and stuff. They fought quite a bit. They know how to use bows. They know how to use horses, that kind of thing. And Islam provides a framework to kind of do away with all the things that were holding them back. The blood feuds that would break out, the lack of any kind of central leadership. Muhammad becomes the first caliph, and everyone just does what he tells them to do. And you have a very strong centralized government that emerges. And you have the brief war between the forces of Mecca and the forces of Medina, which Muhammad winds up winning. And his victories are so big initially that the rest of the Arabian Peninsula decides that he is the Messiah, he is the messenger of God, and they decide to follow him. And I mean, once again, if we just look at the map, within a couple of years, the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula largely submits. I don't think that much of it even really has to be conquered. Generally speaking, people were willing to accept Muhammad as their leader. Now, we'll get into it in a second, but you have a civil war that breaks out, but the early caliphate is saved. And we'll get into the man who saves it because he's another part of this. But like I said, you have this charismatic leader who comes together at a time when Arabia is starting to become an emerging area of the world, succeeds in uniting all the tribes together, and fills them with fanatical religious spirit. The Muslim armies, in contrast to how they kind of used to be known later, were incredibly well disciplined. They didn't break, they didn't run away, they were driven by fanatical devotion to their faith. And given how demoralized their enemies were, because once again, the Sassanids and Byzantines had just been through like 30 years of pointless warfare that resolved nothing. And you have this relatively fresh group who is very much believing at this point in time that God is on their side, coming onto the scene. And so this brings us to Khalid ibn al-Walid. I'm sorry if I mispronounce his name. I'm just going to call him Khalid for the rest of this. And I think it's very arguable that Khalid is the greatest general in history. If I was to do a list of like the top 5 greatest generals in history, it would probably be something like Julius Caesar, Khalid ibn al-Walid, maybe Napoleon, and of course Nader Shah. In fact, I would say Nader Shah is probably the only general I'd put as being definitely above Walid, as I consider him to be the greatest general in history, but we can talk about Nader Shah some other time. My point being that Khalid is kind of like, and I'm sorry if this is a cringy metaphor, he was a bit like an IRL version of Grand Admiral Thrawn. Any battle you put him in charge of just became a complete and total victory. It didn't really matter what the odds were, it didn't matter what he had to work with and what his enemies had to work with. He would just completely destroy everything in his path. And more than that, he knew what to do with a victory. That's an old thing they used to say about Hannibal, is Hannibal knew how to get a victory, he didn't know what to do with it. Khalid was a master of exploiting the various victories. So, to talk a bit about Khalid, he had initially been one of the commanders of the Quraysh tribe during the war against Muhammad. He had won the only actual victory during that war, but he had later on converted to Islam, and Muhammad himself bestowed him with the title, the Sword of Allah. Little did Muhammad know how much he would succeed in that. So, Khalid had a rather let's just kind of go through his battles, because it's kind of, there's so much to kind of cover. You'll kind of see what I mean. And because they had Khalid combined with the centralizing power of the caliphate, you had a political order that could provide Khalid with troops, and you had Khalid who could just destroy basically everything in his path. So early on, you have the conquest of Mecca. Now, we don't know the exact number of soldiers on either side during this, but we can assume he was probably outnumbered by quite a bit. And once we start to kind of get into these numbers, okay, so here we have roughly 10,000 under Khalid, and I'm not sure how many the Muslims had. The Meccans had. I would imagine it would probably be somewhat more. But it was a complete and total disaster for them. Khalid won. The Quraysh collapsed. We then had a follow-up battle against some of the Bedouins. Now, this is probably a exaggeration, but how I tend to view this when we're dealing with Khalid is the scope of the victory is accurate. The numbers of soldiers probably isn't. Like in this battle against the rest of the Arabian tribes, we're told that Khalid is outnumbered 2-1, and it might very well be that case, or it may not be. When they say 4 killed versus like 6,000 killed or captured, that probably is the case. That probably is actually what happened. That degrees, then we have the conquest of Mecca, we have the subjugation of the other people. So shortly after this, and all the various peoples united under Muhammad, Muhammad dies and he's succeeded by his father-in-law, Abu Bakr. Now, Abu Bakr is not really accepted by everybody. I believe it's a majority of the various tribes immediately secede and become apostates, and we have the Ridda Wars in the aftermath of that, where the caliphate is attempting to subjugate them all. Now, once again, this might have been a dire situation, but they had Khalid on their side. So if we look at, for instance, this one, we have, and once again, this is the Muslims really overplayed in their historiography the numbers of their opponents and downplayed the numbers of their soldiers. There's also the issue that this is the Dark Ages. Now, it's not the Dark Ages because there was no civilization. It's the Dark Ages because there's so few written records from this time place. So a lot of the stuff we're basing this on is oral history, stuff maybe some Greek heard about and wrote down, and some stuff that's highly stylized. The book I'm reading says in a lot of cases when you go through these battles, the descriptions look like somebody just kind of copied and pasted them, which is probably what happened. So Khalid wins that one. He wins a second major one. If this is even a little bit accurate, he was outnumbered 6-1. Completely and totally devastated them, 10 times as many casualties. And that's it. Basically, they have two big battles. Khalid just completely annihilates the entire force up against him. And Abu Bakr's like, you know what, Khalid? Just go invade the Persian Empire. We know you can do it. Just go attack the Sassanids. We've just barely conquered Arabia, but we know that you can do it. And part of this is, once again, the successes of Muhammad's charisma in uniting the peninsula and the success of Khalid in basically keeping it united, and Abu Bakr, even though he ruled for 2 years, his competence. People really thought that God was behind them. Something else that the Muslims were able to really take advantage of is a lot of the people in the territories they conquered didn't really care by this point in time who was ruling them. You had a variety of different Christological controversies that had broken out, the Monophysites, the Miaphysites, Nestorianism, all this kind of stuff. And there had been rampant persecution in the Eastern Roman Empire. Heraclius in particular had turned to it as a way of bolstering his religious credentials in the aftermath of the Byzantine Sassanid War. And a lot of those people lived in places like Egypt and Syria and stuff, areas that the Muslims would later invade. So a lot of the people there were kind of indifferent to who ruled over them. Was it really that much worse to have somebody of a different religion rule over you that you had to pay taxes to, rather than have other Christians rule over you who are going to actively persecute you? So in a lot of cases, what the Muslims wound up doing when they were besieging a city is they'd say, look, you just have to pay the jizya, and otherwise we won't sack the city, we won't do anything else. And they had a lot of places that just surrendered, especially when it became clear that the Byzantines and Sassanids were not able to adequately defend any of their frontier settlements, and weren't even really going to try. So Walid was sent into the Persian Empire, and we have the Battle of Chains. Now, I'm just going to read this boast from Khalid that he wrote. Submit to Islam and be safe, or agree to pay the jizya, and you and your people will be under our protection. Else you will have only yourselves to blame for the consequences. For I bring the men who desire death as ardently as you desire life. So Khalid went into the Persian Empire. Now, I think the thing that was kind of a hallmark of his military strategy was he was very, very good at using strategic mobility. Now, Islamic armies were primarily infantry-based at the start, but he was very good at doing forced marches, very good at things like defeating in detail, breaking up his opponents, ambushing them, that kind of thing. So when they were invading Persia, he figured out pretty early through scouting the different Persian armies were trying to kind of combine together, and he was able to just move very rapidly, defeat them in detail. And whenever he would win a battle, he was able to get his troops to be disciplined enough to not immediately loot and to chase down the enemy and exterminate them. So you would have battles where maybe the Persians had 40,000 people and they'd only lose about 5,000 in the actual battle. But because he chased them down, he'd be able to kill another 15 to 20,000 and just completely and totally destroy them. So we had the Battle of Change, which Walid won. Then we have the Battle of the River, which was another battle in which Khalid won. Once again, take these numbers with a giant salt mine. The Muslim sources massively overestimate what they're up against. Well, they were certainly up against larger forces that were better equipped. It's not as if it was 2 to 1. It might be something like 8,000 versus 12,000 or something, or 14,000. It's not normally actually like 500 versus 30,000. That tends to just kind of be the way it is. An interesting thing that Walid pioneered was he would have his generals and his officers go to the enemy and basically say, look, fight me IRL. So Walid would go up and he'd challenge the enemy commander or provincial governor or something. And he was a very good fighter, so he would, generally speaking, just kill them in single combat. And his people tended to be better at dueling. So they'd have all these duels, and he would often kill off a lot of the opponent's officer corps and greatly demoralize them before the battle would even start. But Walid would do stuff like he'd lay ambushes days in advance. He was very good at using the terrain, of isolating his opponents, cutting off pieces of their army. And so we have a series of basically 3 battles that completely annihilates the Sassanid army, at least in Western Persia, and secures, I think, everything up to the Euphrates River for the Islamic forces. And then we just have another battle that he completely and totally dominates in. Yeah, there's a lot of Khalid battles where he just annihilates entire Persian field armies. And so this brings us up to, let's see, here's the campaign in the West. The campaign against the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Byzantines at this point were in a very sorry state. They didn't really have much to work with. Another kind of aspect that the Arabs had in their advantage was the Byzantines and Sassanids were kind of slow to react because they'd been raided by Arabs before. Arabs had attacked them before. They just kind of, the Byzantines, I don't even think, put an army together. They were just thinking, oh, they're just going to sack a couple of villages. They won't be able to penetrate any of our walls, and then they can just go through. The Arabs were able to capture some Persians who taught them how to make siege weapons. Also, cities can only hold out so long if there's no reinforcements coming, and there was no reinforcements coming. So we had a series of battles against the Byzantines in their Arab client states. They succeeded in the first battle of destroying the Ghassanid kingdom, which was a Christian Arab state, and basically destroying the Byzantines' allies. And then we get to a series of different battles against the Byzantine forces proper. So once again, we have to take these numbers with a giant salt mine. Here we have Walid with 10,000 beating possibly up to 60,000. Once again, that's not anywhere close to what it is. So yeah, we have that battle. Then we have Fahal, which is another complete and total curb stomping of the Byzantines. The Siege of Damascus. Where's Yarmouk? Yarmouk is kind of the big one during the this war. Yarmouk. Yeah, this was kind of the big one in which the entirety of the Levant fell. So once again, we have estimates here that's like 10,000 versus 150,000. It was probably closer to like 20 versus 40,000. But my point is, you have these 2 greatly weakened superpowers, and they threw literally everything they could possibly get at the Muslim armies, and Khalid basically just took their supper and completely and totally blew them out. And there was really nothing left to stand in his way. The Byzantines made no real attempt to even defend Egypt. There's very few primary sources about the conquest of Egypt, but it more or less just immediately collapsed and surrendered. Very little actual fighting happened there. The Byzantines just kind of continued to lose. Once again, within like a decade or so, the Sassanids had collapsed. The Byzantines were able to survive a bit better as they withdrew from all of their Middle Eastern parts and withdrew to the Anatolian heartland and kind of set up a defensive perimeter. But even so, they were kind of snookered as well. And there wasn't really anything stopping the Muslims to the west. And eventually they made it to the Visigothic kingdom in Spain. Now that collapsed very quickly because the Visigothic king died in the first battle. There had been a succession war prior. There was no clear successor after that. And the small remainder of the Visigothic kingdom fled north to establish the kingdom of the Asturias that would eventually become the Reconquista. But yeah, like I said, you had these two superstates, both of which collapsed quite quickly. Obviously, the Byzantines managed to survive for another 800 years or so. So they were doing something right. But it was just this combination of having one of the greatest generals in history, an unusually charismatic man in Muhammad, and Arabia ascended at a time when the great superpowers were just complete shells of their former selves. Some might even say echo of their former self, and say that shell of their former self doesn't even really begin to describe just how bad the situation was that they were facing at the particular time. Although, ironically enough, the Rashidun Caliphate would not last particularly long, scarcely more than a couple decades before being replaced by the Umayyads, which led to a complete and utter disaster that was the Abbasid Revolution. I think the Umayyad Caliphate only lasted for about 100 years or so, and was constantly at war with itself, given the fact that the ruling class was extremely Arab supremacist. So that's kind of the rise of Islam. And like I said, I think that's a good example of something where everything just happens to go right. All the stars align, and you're able to just completely sweep away everything in your path. It doesn't happen too often, but you can really see why Muslims think that there was a degree of divine intervention in the rise of their empire. They did kind of go from a bunch of camel herders to masters of half the world within just 100 years or so. A feat which, other than maybe the Mongols and Alexander, I can't really think of anyone else who's achieved something like that. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. These history videos take quite a bit of time for me to